Welcome to ARMA International's webinar, Tips for Security and Compliance in Microsoft Teams. Today's webinar is sponsored by the great folks at Netwrix. I am Ann Snyder, Content and Education Director. I'll be your host and moderator for this webinar. For those of you who have attained your IGP, the Information Governance Professional Certification, today's webinar counts toward one continuing education credit in the Information Management category. If you have a question during today's webinar, feel free to ask in the Q&A box. We're unlikely to get to all questions, but we'll respond to any remaining questions received after the webinar has concluded. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to take care of. First up is professional membership. If you haven't checked out your membership benefits lately, we're excited to offer online and virtual opportunities to connect and get resourced through your membership. If you aren't an ARMA professional member yet, as you can see, there are a lot of resources to take advantage of, and it's a great and affordable way to get resourced as an information professional. Also, be sure to keep an eye out for our members-only webinar series. We launched this last month. Our first one was with Steve Weissman. We have one coming up on April 1st with Ann Gore and company. So keep an eye out in your calendars and your inboxes. And be sure to tune in on our webinar on the 25th. This is for the IG Maturity Index report. It's our first year-over-year data, and we have some exciting stuff to report. So more information about ARMA membership and getting started can be found on our website at arma.org. ARMA InfoCon 2021. Be part of the action by presenting your skills and best practices to the finest in the profession at our first hybrid conference. We're going to be live in Houston with Virtual Components on Live, October 17th through the 20th, 2021. With more than 100 sessions and 8 session tracks on the agenda. There's something for everyone to learn and teach at ARMA InfoCon 2021. The call for proposals is open through March 12th. That's tomorrow, so get your proposals in. ARMA seeks sessions that are fresh, engaging, and offer real-world practical solutions and takeaways. So let me introduce our panelists. We're up first today was going to be Mark Rackley. He's a partner and chief strategy officer at the PAIT Group. Mark, can you say hi? You're on mute, Mark.
You know, I can say hi if I unmute. So okay. Hello, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Thanks for being here. And then we have David Metzgar, who is the solution engineer at Netwrix.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for taking time today.
And then last but not least, this is a repeat player on the ARMA webinar stage, is Jeff Melnick, our chief, who is the director of solutions engineering at Netwrix.
Yeah, good to be back. Thanks.
Great. All right, let me get to our agenda. So with the massive move toward working remotely, it seems that everyone is using Microsoft Teams these days. And a lot of this is done, unfortunately, without a full understanding of how it works and what security and compliance features are available behind the scenes. And if you're ready to learn what you might be missing, we're going to talk about that today. So we'll start with Mark, who's going to talk to us about what actually happens when you create a team. And then we'll turn to some of the native security and compliance features for Teams. And then eventually we'll turn finally to Jeff, who's going to talk about how you can get a bird's eye view of some of the things that you might want to keep track of in addition to those native security features in Teams. And we'll take a short break to look at a demo, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A. So let me hand it over now to Mark.
All right, can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so, you know, as we've been talking about in the past year, there's been just massive growth of Microsoft Teams. I think the latest numbers were there's 115 million daily active users of Teams. And many of these organizations, you know, just started using Teams overnight without fully understanding what goes on when you create a team. I know a lot of the times we're helping our clients just come to grips with what they've done. So, you know, kind of my role here is to kind of put the fear of God in you guys so you understand what are the implications when you actually go through and do something as simple as creating a Microsoft team. So you may think you're just creating a team. Whenever you create a team, there's actually a lot that goes on. So when you create a team, what actually happens is it creates an entire SharePoint site collection. And this is going to be used for storing files and other information. And it's a full-blown SharePoint site collection. You can go ahead and create pages in that SharePoint site. You can create applications. You can add those to your team. You also get a planner plan. It spins up an Office 365 group. You get a OneNote. A Power BI workspace gets created, as well as streams channels. So all of these pieces get created just simply by creating a team. And Microsoft has made it so easy for users to create teams. What's more, if you start doing other things like maybe creating something called private channels, every time you create a private channel, it creates another SharePoint site collection within your environment. And you can have up to 2 million site collections now in your tenant. So you can just fathom how much information is getting created from people just using Teams the way you've been trained to use it. And finally, recently, Microsoft has announced something called Dataverse, which allows you to create Power Apps, Power Automate flows, also some chat bots within Microsoft Teams. Well, every time you spin up a new Power App in this environment, or every time you spin up a new bot, it's actually creating an entire Power Platform environment for that team. So it's possible for every team to have its own Power Platform environment just from using Teams. So there's so much there. So just a quick review of what's there. You get the SharePoint sites, you get the group inbox, calendars, planner, stream, and a lot of these things get auto provisioned, so you don't have any control over it. You may only get that multiple SharePoint site when you create a private channel, but so many of these things just get provisioned. What's more, when you're using Teams, information gets stored in multiple locations as well. So when you're actually storing files and sharing files, well, if you're sharing a file within a team, it's actually getting stored into that SharePoint site associated with that team. Where if you're sharing files one-on-one, maybe in a one-on-one chat, those files are getting stored in your OneDrive. And then that chat information is getting stored in Exchange. And then for the meeting information, those meeting recordings are going to be stored in either SharePoint or those are going to be stored in OneDrive as well. So Microsoft has created this really great tool for us to really just jump in and easily get started, but there's so many things that get created simply by using the tool the way it's supposed to be used.
Okay, do we want to hand it over now to David?
That is my cue. I'll go ahead and take over here and share my screen. You should be able to see it right now. Is that the case? You all able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, thanks for the introduction and background, Mark. Yeah, my job here is to talk about some of the steps in planning for a team's governance solution, which I know ideally when it comes to any new solution of technology, you want to plan as much as possible before you deploy. All right, but that could be very challenging. It could be very time consuming. It's multifaceted. You have a lot of different stakeholders involved, different IT roles, business owners, managers, even end users. And you have to coordinate schedules. You have to look at testing, pilot rollout, and then full deployment rollout requirements and plan for it to all be a fairy tale ending. Well, in reality, effective planning is often skipped. In fact, if we had a show of hands here, I'm sure a lot of you would say, yeah, I've deployed services in the past without effective planning. And as a Microsoft trainer for the past 25 years, I can't tell you how many IT professionals I've had in my classes who are taking a training class for a product that they just deployed in the previous month. So learning something about something that they've already deployed, kind of getting the cart before the horse. But that's very normal because of the schedules and priorities. And in regard to transitioning to the cloud, there's been an acceleration. Pushing organizations to the cloud has happened in an accelerated pace without the planning that would normally be required because of things like work from home scenarios. So now that maybe the dust has settled after you've gone through that transition, it's time to take a look at how things have been set up with default settings and if there's any adjustments that you have to make in order to make it more efficient. And so now it's not a one and done type of thing. The good news is that you can always revisit these topics, and we're going to focus more on security in this module, in this session today, but there's always room for improvement. In fact, even if you've deployed Microsoft Teams and have it running for quite some time, that might have been planned out well in the past, but maybe your needs have changed since then. And this is something that you have to revisit on a periodic basis, just to make sure that your current plan in functionality and security is still meeting your needs. Now on the slide here, you have some of the questions you'd want to ask and answer in the planning phase, or when you're revisiting these topics. And every organization has different controls as far as who's going to be in charge of the groups and the teams, and are we going to allow guests? Are these teams temporary or are they permanent? So as you answer these questions, there's always going to be a balance that you're trying to strike between full functionality and security. Full functionality on one hand that has no security is going to make things very easy to be available, and just by the very nature of teams being user-driven and user-focused, that ease of collaboration, ease of communication is built into it, but it could be at the expense of some security. Now, on the other end, if you go too secure with your deployment of any solution, especially Teams, it's not going to have the functionality that you want Teams to offer. So you want to have a good balance and have a sweet spot in dealing with those. And we'll talk about that here in a couple of slides, and an approach to take to make that happen. Well, based on your organizational IT model, if it's centralized or distributed, you might have a couple people doing everything or different roles to assign to different personnel. Your Office 365 subscription has a lot of tenant level roles, as well as service level roles that you can leverage, including Teams, Exchange, and Azure. So regardless of your IT model, though, you want to implement the least privilege principle. You want to assign the least permissive role to the users in order for them to perform their job. So, and unlike other services, Teams is going to have a lot of delegation for those that might not be in a traditional IT role. So here are some of the roles that you would have to consider if you want to implement this role-based security model just for Teams. Instead of making everyone global admins, you could have a team administrator who, the team admin or team service admin, is going to be in charge of all settings within Teams. Your teams themselves, the members, the settings, organizational-wide permission. And then you have kind of lower level admins that are in charge of maybe just the communication side, the phone number inventory and assignments, or those that are dealing with call issues and being able to troubleshoot at different levels with the tools available for all calls or just individual calls based on the role. And if you're using certain peripheral devices, monitors, phones, tablets, that are incorporated into the Teams services, you can even have a Teams device administrator. So it all starts with the plan, and once you have a plan, you can then implement that plan through the various tools that you see here. You could use the Microsoft 365 Admin Center to assign the roles we just talked about. You could also use the Azure portal. Or if you're a PowerShell fan, you can install the Microsoft Teams PowerShell module to do this kind of thing. But this is not a one-time task either. As your needs change, you need to update your role assignments just like you'd update groups. So oftentimes we change group membership based on role changes in the organization for permission. Roles need to be part of that adjustment as well. So once you've assigned the right roles to the right people, then they can go into the Teams Admin Center or even the Teams clients to perform some of their administrative responsibility. They can go and create teams, add, remove members from the Teams admin portal. I don't have a screenshot for that here, but that's another tool that's web-based that you can go in and start managing the teams based on your permissions assigned. Now, part of your plan, we want to understand the role that Microsoft 365 groups play, not just in Teams, but everything else that leverages this component. So notice the ripple effect. It says here Microsoft Groups is a cross-application membership service in Office 365. And you have one group, and from that, you have all these different areas that are affected, including what services that group has access to, whether it's Teams, SharePoint, Outlook, whatever, or it could be dealing with the permission surrounding that group and the data governance and protection of the files and the data to be compliant, or it could be some third-party integration application. So a little sidebar discussion here is we need to make sure we understand the difference between Active Directory groups and Microsoft 365 groups. I talked to many people who would say that they are synchronizing their Active Directory with their tenant in their 365 subscription. So they have all the group membership managed internally, that it's all under control. Or maybe we're not even using Azure, we're just using Teams and Exchange and SharePoint. However, Microsoft 365 groups are stored in Azure AD, and they're what are driving the functionality of Teams and a lot of the other services for that collaboration. And so they're not related at all to the Active Directory groups that you might be synchronizing from your internal domain. All right, so when someone says we're not using Azure, they might be thinking a platform as a service, infrastructure as a service option. You're using Azure AD when you have an Office 365 subscription. All right, so something to keep in mind is that not all Microsoft 365 groups are going to have corresponding teams, as well as knowing that all teams that you create do have corresponding 365 groups. Let me say that again. Not all Microsoft 365 groups have a corresponding team, but every team does have a corresponding Microsoft 365 group. So it's basically a team is a Microsoft group that has collaboration and communication functions for its owners and members. So you want to plan these groups and these teams accordingly based on the level of access you want to give them. And think of it in not a kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. You want to have maybe tiers of restrictions, various levels of permissions or restrictions based on what it is that's in the team. So for example, if you could picture in your mind an inverted triangle or pyramid where at the top is wide open or pretty wide open, maybe for public teams, where data and communication that you want to allow for external users can be within that public team space. Then you want to narrow the restrictions and have more of a private team that's more organizational wide, things that cannot be shared externally, but are within your organization. And then you can narrow it down even further, or teams based on department, geographical location, projects that have more control over who's a member and what they can do. And then even getting more secure with even highly sensitive data and communication between executives, research and development, and even limiting communication between teams is a possibility with communication barriers. So this is a part of your plan, right? And so if what you're using and what you've deployed so far has gotten out of control, you can always go back and revisit these topics and try to improve things as time goes on. A part of group management is sometimes initiated by the user who creates a team. And that group is going to be given a name that they make up. So their groups are a core component. So we want to have a naming convention or some guidelines at least that when groups are created or teams are created, we have a naming convention that is intuitive, is a consistent, brief, but descriptive way of identifying the teams that we can communicate with. And so it makes it harder to find things. It's very inconsistent. But if I want to sort and find things based on a naming convention, that's going to help your users be more productive. On top of that, if you wanted to enforce naming convention, there's this thing you're seeing on the slide here. That's a policy for group naming. Now, some of the features we're talking about in Teams in this webinar might only apply to certain subscriptions. So keep that in mind, that not every subscription level has all the features we're talking about, but we're just talking about things in general. And if you have the right level of Azure subscription here, you can create this group naming policy in Azure AD portal. So you can do things like identifying a department, location, numbering system or attribute that is a prefix or suffix of the name of the group. And they'll make things really consistent because you're applying a policy that is the group's names will have to be compliant with. In addition to the group names being consistent and following a certain pattern, because a lot of the teams are built and the corresponding groups based on projects, which are not finite groups. They're for a particular year or a particular segment of the year. You can have, instead of the manual cleanup work that typically happens when you have to look at an expired project and see how long it's been since a group's been used and manually delete it, you could also be proactive, have an expiration policy set up in your tenant for certain groups that are more going to be coming and going because of the nature of the project. And so what happens with the expiration of 180 days or 365 days or some custom number, the owners of that group will be emailed as the expiration gets closer. And you could either extend the expiration because the project is longer than expected, but eventually if the project is going to expire and the group is deleted, all the messages, all the chat messages and data in that team will be gone as well. Now, if you have a retention policy set up in your security and compliance portal, the data that's in that team will be in the retention policy container in order to look at that for investigation, not for the user, but for further investigation for retention policy, as well as this option here for 30-day group retention, 30-day group restoration period if you removed a group prematurely. Within the Teams Admin Center, there's various reports that will help you get a sense of how teams are being used or not being used, and identify how your organization has adopted or users have adopted the technology. And it might be just usage patterns, which days of the week, which teams are leveraging this service the most or are abusing the service the most. If there's any training that this might reveal that has to happen, because this very much has to be embraced by the end user to maximize it. These reports here, as long as you have the right roles listed on the slide here as either global admin or one of those other roles, you can run these reports and see the type of activity for users or devices that could be helpful. You also have different reports at the tenant level, and based on your role at the tenant level, you can run service level reports. And these ones are showing us kind of another way of looking at the activity reports for teams within that portal. These reports can be downloaded in for up to 180 days of activity. The ones I just showed you in the previous slide within the Teams admin portal, those are just going to be for 90 days. So both have the information at different levels to store it, either shorter or longer duration. Now, earlier I mentioned the functionality and balance between security and functionality that you want. And multi-factor authentication is in those kind of discussions. It's going to be a more secure way of authenticating by having just not my name and password required, but some kind of a token that's either sent to my phone as a temporary code to verify that I have the device that I need to prove my identity, or an authentication app on my phone that helps me prove that I am really who I claim to be. So that's something to keep in mind in general, with or without Teams. But one of the things you could also consider is whether or not you want to go beyond that, take it a step further. So it's not enough to know that a user is logging in, but where are they logging in from? What are they trying to do if they're connecting from an untrusted location? So users are going to be connecting to Teams and other services, either within your private network, where there's a lot more loose restrictions, there's a lot more openness in the restrictions offered, or they might be connecting from some unauthorized location, trying to do the same types of things. So with a conditional access policy, you can have some of the things here defined for which groups, which conditions have to be true in order to block or grant access. Now, if you're a part of different groups that have different policies assigned, the settings for those are going to merge. Unless there's a conflict between a block and grant access result, where blocking is always going to win. So this has to be planned out so you get the right outcome. But there's a pretty cool what if tool that you can launch in the conditional access utility to see if what you're anticipating is going to have the results that you're looking for. In your Microsoft Security and Compliance Center, there are a lot of reports as well as alerts that will help you be proactive in finding out if there's certain activity taking place within Teams that you want to be aware of. It could be that a group has been created. It could be that something's been shared, a file in your Teams has been shared externally. If you have advanced threat protection enabled in your tenant, it could also pick up and give you alerting on files that are found to be malicious. So here you have the built-in rules that you can leverage. You could also create your own custom rules based on whatever you wanted to look for, who's going to be alerted with an email message, as well as being able to look at that information in your portal. Oops, there you go. My last slide here is kind of a launching of multiple discussions, multiple webinars on areas of security and compliance. And I'm not going to give you a rundown on each of these items, but just oftentimes when we think about security and compliance, we're thinking about email communication. And for, let's say, a data loss prevention solution, making sure that sensitive data is not going to be sent out to unauthorized people, or it has to be approved before data that's secure can be sent outward, or it's blocked entirely. Now, that functionality that's been around for many years in different ways also would apply to teams. So think about the communication happening within your teams, the files being shared, the data loss prevention of your different Microsoft subscriptions can apply rules to that as well. Retention policies, keep what you need, get rid of what you don't based on the settings of your policy for legal requirements or compliance regulations. Legal holds, e-discovery, allow me to capture the data, email, communication, chat, files for a user being investigated that allows things to be frozen in time, to be searched and reviewed by the right personnel for future legal reasons. And if you want to have communication barriers applied, have some policies for what kind of language can or cannot be used within your teams. All these areas here, again, could have their own webinar, but this just keep in mind that the resources and tools you have with your subscription, don't just think about Exchange or SharePoint, think about how they can apply to teams to leverage the power of those technologies. All right, that's all I have for now. I'm going to head over to my esteemed colleague, Jeff. So Jeff, take it away.
Yeah, thanks a lot, David. Let me switch. Yep, I guess I do. Perfect. Awesome, and hopefully everyone can see my screen. I have to ask that, sorry about that. So let me dive right in. Basically, we get a lot of requests for things like, we do a lot of auditing at Netwrix. That's one of our big things. So we collect change data, we collect who has access to what currently, that type of information. And then what happens is they ask us about teams. Hey, do you guys track teams and what happens in teams? So obviously you can see that teams is not just a simplistic, let's fit everything into a box. It's a little bit more complicated than that. So we can definitely pull a lot of that information. And with most sort of audit projects that we get, we have a client that comes to us and say, hey, again, can you, track all the changes in teams? And we always have to ask, well, do you really want all the changes? And sometimes the answer is yes, but usually the real answer is no. And they have some very specific requirements that they want to pull in and they want to take a closer look at. So let's really sort of diving into those. Sorry about that. So one of the big things is sensitive information. So the ability to go out and determine, is there sensitive information floating around in teams, find that information, and basically, if necessary, quarantine that data. So very, very easy to pull files up, throw them into teams, and that's awesome. And if you have external sharing turned on, that can be a little bit more challenging, right? So we really need to be very, very careful with the types of data that we put into teams that we want to share. So for example, right now we're in the midst of a merger ourselves, and there's a lot of sensitive data, as you can imagine, around personnel, et cetera, that we don't necessarily want everyone to have access to. But again, Teams is a very, very convenient place to put that information. So something in HR, for example, no problem. But if I have HIPAA-related documents out in a more public-facing site, I probably want to pull that out. So I'll go through and I'll cover that. And again, really tightly controlled with that is who actually has access to that data, whether it's just general information or much more sensitive information. Again, this could be things like patient records around health. It could be a variety of different types of information. Also, again, detecting changes to those. Not only do we want to see necessarily who has access, but changes made to that access. And then also any kind of sort of suspicious activity or really any activity. So with things like GDPR, CCPA, and all the other ones coming down the line, if there's an issue and there's a breach, or even a suspected breach, the ability to go in and say, hey, you know what, this account was breached, this account had a lot of access to a lot of information, I need to know what records this account accessed in a certain time frame. that is a very legitimate request, and a very time-saving and potentially money-saving request as well. So if I know what records and what patients, what employees, et cetera, have been affected, much easier for me to kind of contain that information and take action against that information. Guest activity is definitely, outside of permission information and sensitive data, is a big question mark. So if you allow guest activity, that's awesome. Again, anyone can really invite someone else. And so the ability to very easily and almost too easily share data with external users is a challenge. And so knowing things like when external users are invited into your tenant, and then also what they're doing. So one of the things that we see, and I've seen working in this industry for as long as I have, is it doesn't necessarily have to be malicious. It could just be a mistake. You have no idea how many minor issues have turned into major issues because someone simply did something wrong, or wasn't paying attention. So the ability to go through and see what's going on, and sharing out large volumes of data or sensitive data to external users can be pretty stressful. Around that is going to be privilege elevation. So again, you probably want to know something like, yeah, actually, maybe you don't even want to know this, but knowing when a new team is created. This is one of those things that's usually more of a nice to have. Hey, yeah, that's cool, because again, as David mentioned, it doesn't take too much to build a team. You could go crazy with teams. In fact, we see that kind of run all over the place. And so you might actually want to go through and see who's creating teams, what's out there, and do more of a sort of general audit around that information as well. Not that you have dozens and if not hundreds or thousands of teams floating around, you don't really know what they're being used for. Things like permission changes to those teams, making someone a team owner, for example. Those are all, again, requests that we get for, hey, what's actually going on inside of our environment? And then lastly is logon activity. And this is an interesting one as well, where we're able to go out and figure out who's actually logging in. And again, the funny thing is I'm going to show you a lot of information we actually gather from multiple different places. So SharePoint Online obviously is a big one, is a big place. We can pull some data from Exchange Online, from Azure AD, et cetera, all those kind of pieces that coalesce and bits that are used to actually make up teams. So one of the things that people want to know is if I've got external users that are accessing my data, maybe if a contractor, right? So again, we've currently internally are going through a merger. We have an external contractor working with us that actually has access to a lot of our data. One of the things we might want to know is where are they actually logging in from, and are they who they say they are? So for example, again, with things like MFA, it makes life a lot easier. But again, you can still go through and grab that information. MFA is not foolproof. It gives you another level of defense, but it's not foolproof. You can still grab the token. So that's not an easy piece to do, but it is possible. We do see that. So you might want to know if your consultant is suddenly logging in from, Nigeria or China or Russia. Those are things that might be a red flag. So again, the ability to see not only who's logging in, but also from where. So with that having been said, let me dive in and I will show you a couple examples. So let me pop in here. And I could drop this out of the way. But so let me dive in. I'm going to show you some reporting. It's got a number of different ways to pull data out. And one of the things we can do is look at sensitive data. So the ability to go out and classify data, and as time allows, I'll pop in and maybe show that to you a little bit as well. But be able to go out and find and classify data across a variety of platforms. Again, we can look at many things, but in this case, we're really interested in SharePoint Online. And again, trying to find what actually is out there. So one of the things you'll find is, again, Teams, OneDrive is also part of SharePoint, which is interesting. Rolls up with a slightly different URL in this case, but the teams are almost indistinguishable. So this management team is actually a legitimate team that I created in my Teams environment. And so if I want to go in here and take a look at what types of records are in here and how they've been classified, I can do that pretty easily. So, especially if my server is going to agree with me today, and clearly the answer is going to be no. There we go. So the ability to go through and see, what documents are out here and how they are classified, and I could drop these out as well. So if I wanted to go through here and take a look at just specific ones, like I've created a couple of taxonomies in here as well, or some rule sets to find data. So if I just want to drop this out and just look at some documents, I could do that, and you can see, this affidavit is classified as legal, and I've got some other more sensitive information, GLBA, PII, much more interesting information. And so this is, I could tell you, is some information around patient records. So it was able to go out, it was able to classify this and determine where the data is. So again, if you're putting this into teams, again, you might want to be a little bit more aware of that versus, say, one of your HR shares that is probably a little bit more locked down, a little bit more difficult to change. So with that having been said, let me pop out and look at things like most exposed to sensitive data. So this allows me to go in and I can see, again, the same types of records that are out here, but I can also drill down and determine who actually has access to these specific records. So for example, just in my sort of root share here, I've got everyone except external users at the moment. If I scroll down here, I've got some other information. So let me go down to this accounting site, for example, and I kind of click in, and it will show me everyone who has access to this currently and what their level of access is. So I can see this guy right here has edit access into this site collection for accounting too. So again, if you need to be able to go through and determine who has access to this information, we can make this a lot easier for you to do that. As I mentioned, one of the things you want to do is also have a better idea as far as who's actually accessing that data. So we can do that pretty easily as well. So again, I look at things like activity related to sensitive data objects, and I can pop into here, and here you can see this is actually my external user account that I've got in this particular piece. This is a patient record that was added, documents that were read, etc. So I can see all the content changes, who's accessing the data, who's adding data, who's deleting data. That's another common one, as well as who is, of course, reading information. Now, on the SharePoint side, again, we can pull a lot of information in. We can also go through and look at not just sensitive information, but we can look at some of the Azure data as well. So for example, again, group membership changes, because again, all those pieces are sort of tied together with Office 365. We can also go down through and look at more sort of specific SharePoint changes, who's accessing data, security changes, group changes, as well as, again, who has access, including things like broken permission inheritance as well. That's a big issue that a lot of people have, is tracking down things like broken permissions, especially in SharePoint. It's very, very challenging to do. You have to kind of drill into it and see what's going on. So once you create that site collection, if you go down and you break inheritance at some point, you'll normally just look at the root site collection, and that may not be the right information, right? So information, you may have information that's far more exposed than you initially believe. So let me take a step back. I've shown you a bunch of reports. I'm going to show you some more sort of ad hoc queries as well. So going back to the idea of external users, let's pop in and take a look at some of my external users. So one of the really interesting things that, if you're not already aware of, you should be, is when you create an external sharing invitation, it goes out, what will happen is you'll basically create a user account within Azure, which conveniently has this ext in here. I'm actually going to specify just the last 7 days, so I don't get a huge slew of stuff. But I can very easily go out here and basically see all the different records that have been accessed, modified, renamed in this case, deleted, etc., as far as what's actually going on out here. So for example, here's some documents. So if I want to drill into this and just take a quick closer look, you can see this Teams architecture PowerPoint that was added out here. Again, very easy to see. So I can actually see all of the activity from this external user. And you can see the format that's used for this is basically my external address with this #ext# at the tenant information in here. So very, very easy to go through and pull this information in. Now you might say, hey, that's awesome. I want to know that information. But you might also want to say, hey, you know what, that might be more concerning to me. And so you can actually go through here and create alerts as well. So I can save this as a report. I can subscribe to this. I can also create alerts. And the cool thing about this is I might want to do something like create a threshold. So maybe I change a filter. Maybe I don't want to see just external data. Maybe it's just external data for certain site collections, HR, payroll, those types of things where you know you have people out there. You can set thresholds in here as well. So let's say in this case, I've got 100 activity records for within 10 minutes. So I have really a high level of activity. Again, could be a potential breach in that case and see what's going on. You can actually, based on alerts, take actions against these as well, which is interesting. So you can generate things like PowerShell scripts or other things that can actually take action and be reactive to some of those events that come in, instead of just getting an email that says, hey, someone just accessed 1,000 of your documents. So you can definitely be a lot more reactive in that case. I'm going to discard this. So let me give you another one as far as this is concerned. I'll drop into advanced mode. So what I'm going to do here is look for object type equals user. And I'm going to look at my details. And this is one of the interesting things about Teams and SharePoint Online in general is they like to put different things in different places. So for example, I can see the who as far as on the left-hand side here, as far as who's actually accessing this data, you know, what that external account is. But what if I want to go through and I want to get an alert or something else there we go, contains, there we go. Every time someone is actually added to my tenant externally. Again, very easy to go through and generate this type of information. Again, this could be a report, or this might be more of an alert, depending on how frequently you do this. So the ability to see that, the ability to go through and drill into that information is a little bit more useful. So let's touch a little bit on groups. So I'll do data source equals Azure. There we go. And then let's do object type of group. And let me see, this is probably gonna give you too much information, but there we go. So now you can see all different types of information. So if I want to just see things that were added, I can pull that in, change the membership, etc. So I can see all the different groups, all the different teams that are out here, who's been added to those, etc. I can even do, again, a slightly more specific query to do something like contains, oh, there we go, contains, what was I going to contain? It's been one of those days. Owner, that's what it was. Especially if I can spell owner correctly. Hey, there we go. So again, I can see anyone who's been given ownership as well. So again, this is information that you might want to drill into a little bit more detail and see exactly what is going on. So those are some of the objects or options you can see. And again, I think it covers pretty much everything except for the logon. So let me cover the logons because that's actually pretty interesting, right? So let's go out here and again, we'll look at data source equals Azure. Awesome. And let's look for something like action equals failed logons. Awesome. And in this case, I'm going to do something like workstation is not equal to, or sorry, does not contain US. So one of the cool things about the logon data is it tends to contain all the information as far as you can see in more detail over here. It's got the actual location, the latitude, the longitude, and that's always going to be the country, comma, and then often the province and or city. So you can see here, I've got a lot of failed logons for a bunch of different accounts from St. Petersburg, from Munich, Germany, from France, from Frankfurt, and also from Great Britain. So the ability to go through and see this information is kind of enlightening, actually, to be able to see this information. Now, obviously, you probably want to see failed logon data within your region as well, but it helps you determine, hey, what regions should I really be taking a closer look at? Again, if you work in certain regions, probably not an issue. Other regions, you probably want to take a closer look when people are logging in from those places. And then obviously, not only can I do that, but let me do this. I'll do workstation. What was the one I was going to do? Contains, do not want equals. Let's put in a bracket. This way I can only get all the location data. And then in this case, I'm going, actually, before I did that, one thing I just wanted to show you, which I thought was cool, is you may have noticed that you can do working hours as well. So if I wanted to see something within normal working hours, I can certainly do that. So maybe I just want to see anything between 5 p.m. to 9 a.m., for example. And again, this way I can get all these sort of anything at 2:30 in the morning, and that's clearly is going to be, sort of off book. So again, that type of information. So let me do this. I'll step back a little bit. And so failed logons, obviously pretty critical, but let's say I want to go and take a look at who's actually in my network. So I can do successful logons. And I'll do workstation does not contain US, and I'll actually do another one as well, just so I get a little bit more specific information. Contains this, so I can make sure I get the address data. And let's take a quick look. Probably should have been a little bit more specific with the time frame, but that's cool. And again, now you can see that I've got a number of successful logons from St. Petersburg, Russia, which is something, if I wasn't aware of, I would probably want to be aware of. So again, very easy to go through and very quickly generate, whether it be alerts, whether it be more reporting data. Again, if you just want to have sort of a summary of that different type of information, much easier to go through and pull in that information. So let me do this. Let me drop my slides back up. Sort of start to wrap up here. So hopefully this webinar has been interesting enough. Hopefully this demonstration is interesting as well. Just to give you a little bit of background, we look at a variety of different platforms. So certainly things like SharePoint Online, SharePoint On-Prem, AD, etc., and obviously Teams, but also the ability to go out and track not only change, but who has access to a variety of different platforms, be able to crawl different platforms as well to be able to find and potentially tag sensitive data as well. For those of you who are not aware, Netwrix has actually recently merged with a company called StealthBits, if you aren't familiar with those guys. So the interesting thing about this is, even though we're in this very similar space of security audit, protection, etc., we work in very different sort of organizational sizes. So now we've got a much broader portfolio to help you secure your information. If you found any of this interesting, especially on the demo side, feel free to jump on our website. You can do the in-browser demo, just kind of a quick walkthrough. You can download this. It's a free trial if you'd like. It's fully functional, and we fully support the trial as well. So if you'd like to jump on and download it, or you have any issues, let us know. And then obviously you can have a demo as well. And with that having been said, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Ann.
All right, thanks. Thank you so much, Jeff. I'd like to ask all the panelists to put their cameras back on, and we'll just go through some of these questions. One of the questions I think that's been asked at several points is whether this applies to a specific specific version of Teams, but I think this was meant to be a generic overarching kind of discussion. So I don't know if anyone wants to add on that. Go ahead.
Sure. So I was just going to add, I think someone asked about the government tenant. So we are rolling out support for GCC High as well, which is for all of the major government tenants. It's very hard to pull data out of there because, as you mentioned, it is different. Also, one of the things that's funny is, even though we're a Microsoft Gold partner, we don't actually have access to their GCC High tenant. We cannot, as a partner, gain access to it. So we actually have to work with other clients to be able to do that research. So that's something that will be available in the next couple of months, actually.
Our next question was, what is the extent to which machine learning and AI is used in identifying suspicious behavior in Teams?
That's an interesting question. It's kind of like anything else. I didn't really show you some of the stuff that we have as far as being able to graph. We have a mechanism that looks at alerts, gathers that data. We can assign risk scores, values, etc. Really, and you can apply that to machine learning as well if you have a machine learning mechanism. It's something we've tinkered with as well. Right now we do mostly a lot of. I didn't really get into a lot of the graphical stuff. I kind of ran out of time, but we can definitely look at trends, stuff like that. So there's 100% a place for that, and we found this to be very helpful for setting those thresholds. For example, as far as what is normal, as far as what are normal, some of the normal reactions. So hopefully that makes sense.
Okay. This is another question on sort of expiration of teams and defensible disposition. What happens to the data in an expired team, and is there defensible disposition? I think we did touch on some of the answers to that, though.
Yeah, well, there's a 30-day period where you can gain access to the data within the teams that expired or is deleted. But then if you have a retention policy set up, and that's going to be based on your subscription level and retention policy settings, the data is going to be stored there for whatever the retention period is. And for those that have access to see what's been retained, or for it's a compliance or some kind of an e-discovery legal hold scenario that goes along with that, there's different roles assigned for all the pieces to have different people having their hands at different levels of permission. So that's vastly complex, but if you can conceive of something like a scenario that would keep things secure, accessible, but not a free-for-all, those are all well thought up at Microsoft. And there's just so much on Microsoft's site that could help answer some of those questions, more technical detail, but yeah, I think retention is there to help keep what you need and get rid of what you don't. And yeah.
So we have a question on some of the reporting features in M365. So are these access and sensitive data reports in M365?
So the ones I showed are not. Microsoft has its own DLP and classification system. So the ones I showed are ours. One of the reasons, so the benefit we can provide to you beyond just the sort of default Microsoft is that we can apply a standard set of taxonomies and rules across all the different platforms. So whether you have on-prem data, data in the cloud, et cetera. Also, again, as David talked a little about earlier, depending on what your subscription is, you may not have access to that. And it's a big jump between, I think it's what, E3 and an E5 license price-wise. May or may not make sense as far as what you're looking for. So we've got different clients that use different options, to be honest with you. It really depends on what you own currently, what you're trying to do. Again, do you want to take additional actions against certain things? So it really depends on what makes the most sense for the customer, to be honest with you, and what their current environment is.
Are records manually classified by users, or is it automatic?
So on our side, we do an automatic classification. There are certain systems out there that will do manual. And in fact, I think Microsoft has that included as well in theirs. The problem
they have a little bit of both. They have a little bit of both. Depends on what your license levels are.
Yeah, so we do all automatic classification, and again, it allows us to be more consistent across the board and across, because one of the things they've done is they've actually done studies where it depends. Users will look at the same document, and depending on the time of the day, whether or not they've had lunch, et cetera, they'll actually classify them differently. So to get consistency across the board is a little challenging sometimes.
Do you have any recommendations for that, or?
So again, it's really going to depend, I think, as far as what the customer's looking for. If they got relatively basic taxonomies, or definitely, if they're just looking for things like social security numbers or credit card numbers, a lot of the built-in Microsoft stuff does that very, very easily. It really depends on, obviously the military uses specific things where they are forced to classify things because that's a lot more sort of subjective. It's going to be much harder to automatically classify something like that. So again, it really depends on what the customer's interested. So we have one of our customers is you know them if I mention them, but I'll just say they make soup, and they have a whole thing looking for intellectual property, which is like their recipes. So we had to build custom taxonomies around things like, how much barley is in there, et cetera. But they didn't want that to get mixed up with inventory documents, for example. So you can do some pretty cool things. It really depends on what the customer's looking for, what their needs are.
This is a fairly specific one. Can you track the oldest email accessed? And it's, for example, user A says they need 10 years worth of email retention. Can you run a report to see if in 2020, the oldest email they re-accessed was originally from 2017 or received in 2017?
Wow, that's a rough one.
Yeah. Within the retention policies, there's rules on that and how long data has to be kept in order to satisfy those requirements. And then you want it to expire at some point and not keep it as well. So part of the retention policy is to deal with both cases, keeping it to make sure we have that history, as well as getting rid of stuff that we don't need because it has been accessed in so many years.
But it's, I think they're getting at the, can you see if the person has actually accessed that information?
Actually accessed it. That's a good question, like Jeff mentioned. Yeah, the Netwrix auditor is not looking at email user activity. It's more security based, auditing who's managing the environment, those kinds of things, and whether or not there's a built-in report for Exchange mailbox activity at that level. I'm not positive.
Yeah, I know we look at things like non-owner activity. So for example, if I go into David's mailbox, then it tracks that information, but and there are tools out there to do that, but again, those are relatively specific around that information. But again, that's one of the reasons that Microsoft, I think for a while, they set their email retention for something like 30 days because they were tired of getting sued all the time and just having to do all these email, requests. So,
so for quarantining sensitive data, can this be driven by the information classification assigned in SharePoint Online or OneDrive?
So I don't know. So certainly, so I guess, yes. So we can definitely go through and quarantine data based on the metadata and the labels that are out there. So if you're already using labels, we can overlay that and say, hey, this doesn't belong here, and yank that out of there. So the answer is yes. Okay.
And this one is related to e-discovery. Are you able to report on e-discovery actions taken within organizations, create case, create holds, add mailbox to hold, create and run search? I mean, typically that stuff is done behind the scenes, is my experience, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it could be as granular as you need to be for whatever the use case is. Within the roles assigned, either initiating the e-discovery or the legal hold, whatever it is, and then those that have access to the data once it's been collected. So, and even within that case, it's going to be case by case. It's not an all or nothing type of deal.
Okay. Is Mark still with us?
He went home.
Do we lose him?
He's already at home.
So this is sort of just a role. So where would records and content management staff fit in these roles? For example, term store, content types, labels, metadata. I think it's a question of sort of what's the role that they would play in this. I think in setting up some of that taxonomy for sure.
Yeah, usually in the setup, I would say would be my guess, the initial kind of rollout, making decisions as far as who's going to have access to it. So I guess yeah, I guess that's, and again, it can get all other stuff as well. Are you doing things like data subject access requests? We can do things like that as well. We can pull that off separately as a separate sort of role. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but
I was going to say it depends.
Yeah.
So this is just a quick one about sort of accessing the tool that you were demonstrating, Jeff. Like, how do you access it? Is it through a separate pane, or can you access it through SharePoint? Is there a click to link to it or something like that?
So right now it's accessed through a thick client. There's some web interface as well, but right now it's through a thick client that basically points back to the server. You can install any workstation and basically just give someone access to it. There are some roles within the tool as well, so that you have access to do configurations or just be able to find data, or just be able to look at specific subsets of data. So if you wanted to give someone access just to SharePoint data, you can do that as well.
Okay. And let's take one more question here. So do you know if everyone that is granted access to M365 disposition module are able to see all content eligible for disposition? This is concerning if everyone can see all of the content for all other program areas. Also, is there a way to identify content that has a disposition of transfer to an archive? And any thoughts on that? Something
Yeah, like I said, I think, like I said earlier, it's not an all or nothing type of deal for these types of cases. So there can be, but it's usually going to be a lot more controlled. So it's not a free for all with that sensitive data.
Okay. All right. I'm going to close it there, and thank you so much. Can you move to the final slide there, Jeff?
I certainly can. There we go.
So I would just want to thank Netwrix for sponsoring today's webinar, Tips for Security and Compliance in Microsoft Teams, and to personally thank all of our speakers. Our next webinar will be announced very soon, so keep an eye in your inbox for that. And before we close, I'd like to remind you to become a professional member at ARMA International. Take the time to invest in yourself. ARMA has an array of resources available for you, including white papers, training, articles, our magazine, and more. And on behalf of our speakers and the wonderful folks at Netwrix who give their time and money to sponsor programming like this webinar today, and all of us at ARMA International, I just want to say thank you for joining us for today's webinar. And I wish you your best in all of your information endeavors, and stay safe and stay well. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all.